Montana Territory, 1882, the wind cut sharp through the Bitterroot Range as Beatrice Sutton stepped off the worn freight wagon, clutching her carpetbag with both hands. Her boots hit the frozen dirt of the ranch yard with a hollow thud. The air smelled of pine smoke, horse sweat, and cold earth. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and squinted toward the porch, where a tall cowboy stood with a rifle resting loosely in one hand and two children clinging to the hem of his worn duster. "Are you the cook?" he asked, voice low and rough like gravel under boot. Beatrice nodded. "Beatrice Sutton, I came from Billings, answered your notice." Her voice trembled a little from more than just the cold. The man gave a quiet nod, eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Elijah Vance," he said simply. "This is my place. And these are my kids, Abel and Ada." The boy looked maybe 6, the girl a little younger. Both had wide eyes and dirt-smudged cheeks. They didn't speak, just stared at her like she was something out of a storybook. Beatrice offered a soft smile, but neither moved. Elijah shifted his stance and gestured toward the house. "You'll find the kitchen stocked. We could use a hot meal." Beatrice followed him inside, her boots echoing on the pine floorboards. The house smelled like dust and ash, and the hearth was cold. She dropped her bag in the corner and rolled up her sleeves. "I'll start with stew," she said, already moving toward the root cellar. "And biscuits, if your larder allows for flour." Elijah just nodded again and disappeared out the back door without another word. By sundown, the house smelled of onion and sage, the kind of scent that settled deep in the bones and made a person feel safe. Beatrice ladled stew into 4 bowls and set them on the table. Elijah returned from the barn with hay in his hair and worry in his eyes. He looked at the food like it might disappear if he blinked. The children stared until Beatrice gently nudged their bowls forward. "Eat while it's hot," she said, voice warm but firm. Elijah sat last, hat off, hair damp from snow melt. He tried to eat without looking at her, but more than once Beatrice caught him glancing up, as if trying to figure her out. "Where are their mother?" she asked softly. Elijah paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Gone," he said. 2 years now." Beatrice nodded, not pressing. She had lost folks, 2 different people, different ways. Loss left the same look on everyone's face. The next morning, she found Ada crying in the parlor. The girl held a threadbare rag doll in her lap, rocking back and forth. Beatrice knelt beside her, brushing the tangles from her dark hair. "Want to help me make biscuits?" she asked. Ada wiped her nose on her sleeve and nodded. By the end of the week, both children followed Beatrice like shadows. She read to them at night, combed the burrs from Abel's hair, and taught Ada how to knead dough without tearing it. Elijah watched from the doorway most evenings, silent and tired, but always there. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Beatrice found Elijah out by the corral, mending a broken fence rail under the moonlight. She brought him coffee in a tin cup. "You do not talk much," she said, offering it to him. He took it, fingers brushing hers. "Never saw the point in saying what folks already know." "What if they do not know?" she asked. He met her eyes, and for the first time, something cracked open behind them, a flicker of weariness edged with something gentler. "Then maybe it is worth saying." Beatrice turned back toward the house, heart beating faster than it should have. Days turned into weeks. Snow melted into mud. Beatrice scrubbed the floorboards, taught Ada how to sew a straight hem, and helped Abel sound out his letters. Elijah worked the cattle and fixed the roof, but more often, he sat at the table while she cooked, asking about her life in Billings, her parents back in Missouri. How she ended up answering a notice for a cook on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. "You ran from something," he said one night, not unkindly. Beatrice stirred the stew and said nothing for a long moment. "A man who wanted to own me, not love me." Elijah nodded like he understood. "You deserve better." She glanced at him, and for once he didn't look away. Later that night, thunder rolled over the range. Abel woke screaming, tangled in his blankets. Beatrice rushed in first, Elijah right behind her. She gathered the boy into her arms, holding him tight. "It is just the sky talking, nothing more," she whispered, rocking him gently. Elijah stood by the doorway, jaw tight, hands clenched. "He gets like that when it storms," he said. Used to be his mother who calmed him. Beatrice looked down at the child in her arms, then up at Elijah. "He is safe now," she said. After that, Elijah stayed closer. He started fixing the kitchen door without being asked, helped her carry water from the stream, even let her talk him into planting onions behind the house. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she found him sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars. "Do you ever miss her?" Beatrice asked, sitting beside him. He was quiet for a long time. "I miss who we were before the dying," she nodded. "Sometimes I think we live a whole life before we ever really begin one." He looked at her then, really looked. "What do you want, Beatrice?" She hesitated, heart suddenly loud in her chest. "A home, a family, maybe not the way I planned, but something real." He reached over and took her hand. His was rough and warm. "I want that too." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her stay there until the stars faded into morning. By spring, the children called her Miss B like it was natural, like she had always been there. Elijah touched her waist when he passed her in the kitchen, lingered when their hands brushed. They did not say much about it, but everything about the way they moved around each other had changed. One morning, Elijah waited for her by the garden with something in his hands. It was a plain silver ring, worn smooth at the edges. "My mother's," he said. "She wore it until the day she died. I reckon it is time someone else wore it now." Beatrice blinked, breath catching. "Are you asking?" "I am not a man of many words," he said, "but I love you and I want you to stay. Not just as a cook, as my wife, as their mother." Tears welled up in her eyes. She reached for his hand. Yes, he slipped the ring on her finger and the world felt solid and warm and right. The children danced around them when they kissed, and the mountains echoed with laughter that had not been heard in years. The morning after the first rains of April brought a stillness to the land that felt like breath held. A low mist clung to the fields, softening the edges of the barn and washing the mountains in pale gray. Beatrice stood by the chicken coop, apron dusted with cracked corn, watching the hens peck with single-minded purpose. Ada crouched beside her, tucking a feather behind her ear like a treasure. "They don't fight like people do," the girl said, eyes fixed on the birds. "No," Beatrice answered softly, "they don't." Inside the house, Abel was bent over a slate board, tongue between his teeth as he shaped letters under Elijah's quiet direction. The boy's brow furrowed with effort. Elijah didn't correct him right away. He waited, watching, letting the child find his own mistake. "2 lines on the B, not 3, Elijah said at last. Tapping gently with the end of a pencil, Beatrice paused in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "He's getting steadier," she said, voice low so as not to break the boy's concentration. "He listens better when he's not being watched," Elijah replied, setting the pencil down. "Like his ma used to say, he's like a bird fly off if you look too close." Beatrice's fingers curled lightly around the doorframe. "You ever think she'd want me here?" Elijah turned, and his gaze held no hesitation. "She'd want someone who stayed." "That's what matters." They buried the rest of that conversation in silence, but it settled into something that didn't need unpacking. Later in the week, Elijah rode out to the southern field to check the new fencing. The rails had been sagging near the creek, and he didn't trust the cattle to stay where they should. Beatrice packed him bread wrapped in cloth and a jar of pickled carrots, tucking them into his saddlebag. "Be back by dark," she said, tying the last knot. "If the post holds," he replied, pressing a thumb to the corner of her jaw before mounting up. He did not kiss her, but the weight of his touch lingered all the same. With Elijah gone, the house felt quieter, though there was plenty to do. Beatrice took the children into the woods to gather wild mint and the first shoots of fiddlehead ferns. Ada skipped ahead, collecting stones shaped like hearts. Abel kept close, asking questions she didn't always have answers to. "Did you ever live near water big enough to see across?" he asked as they walked back through the trees. "My grandfather's land bordered the Mississippi. I used to think it went on forever." "Was it scary?" "No," she said. "It was wide, but it didn't feel empty." That evening, Beatrice let the children help roll out pastry for a pie. They pressed the dough too thin in places, but she didn't correct them. When the crust browned in the oven, and the scent of baked apple filled the kitchen, she saw their mother's absence tucked into the corners of their faces, not loud, just always there. Elijah returned after sunset, his boots heavy with clay. He looked at her first when he stepped inside, then to the children, then back to her. "The post's holding," he said. "For now." Beatrice handed him a plate still warm. "Then we'll hold two." That night, as the wind shifted and brought the scent of pine through the open window, Elijah sat beside her on the edge of their bed. They hadn't shared it long, not officially, but the lines between hers and his had blurred like footprints in soft soil. "You ever think you'd end up like this?" he asked. She traced the edge of his hand with her fingertip. "Not in 100 years. He was quiet a long while. "I don't say much, B, you know that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You don't need to. But if something happened to me," he said, voice low, "I'd want you to keep this place, not for the land but for them. You're not going anywhere." "I don't plan to, but I've seen how fast things change." Beatrice nodded, breath catching in her throat. "Then we'll write it down, make it legal." He didn't answer right away, but she felt the shift in him, how he leaned closer, how his hand settled over hers with a kind of finality. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the grass. Inside, the quiet held, steady as the earth beneath them. By late May, the last frost had vanished from the ground, and the cottonwoods along the creek wore their green like a promise. Beatrice stood barefoot in the garden one morning, skirt hem damp with dew, planting squash beside the rows of young onions. The soil turned easy under her fingers, and she hummed low in her throat something old, handed down from her mama's kitchen, back when the world had felt wide and full of waiting. Elijah watched from the fence, arms folded loosely across his chest, a leather glove tucked in one hand. He didn't say anything until she stood and dusted her hands off on her apron. "You always know what ought to go where," he said. "Same as baking," she replied. "Everything has its place and you don't rush it." He stepped closer, pressed a thumb to her cheek where a streak of dirt had settled. "You ever miss town?" She looked past him, toward the stretch of hills that shaped the horizon. "I miss clean dresses without patches. I don't miss being looked through." Elijah nodded once. "You're seen here." She met his eyes then, steady and unflinching. "I know." That afternoon, Elijah rode out to the neighboring homestead to help an older rancher drive strays back through the southern pass. Beatrice stayed behind with the children, but her thoughts trailed after him like a thread pulled through cloth. She didn't worry the way she once might have his word held weight, and he always came back, but she felt his absence just the same. Inside, Ada sat at the table, tongue between her teeth as she stitched a hem on a feed sack she was turning into a doll dress. Abel lay on the floor with a folded map of the territory, tracing the rivers with a stick of charcoal. "Miss B, how many miles to Wyoming?" he asked, eyes still on the map. "More than we could walk in a day," she answered, kneeling beside him. "Why, I heard, mister. Clay say that's where the riders come from, the ones who take cattle east." Beatrice studied his face. "You thinking about going?" He shook his head quickly. "Just wondering how far things go, what's past the edge." She tapped the map lightly. "More land, more people. But not all of them worth the trouble." "Are you?" he asked, suddenly solemn. She looked at him carefully. "I try to be." He nodded, satisfied, then returned to tracing the Inkai lines of the Missouri River. That evening, Elijah returned with a cut across his forearm from a barbed post. It had already clotted, but Beatrice made him sit by the wash basin while she cleaned it. He didn't flinch, though the peroxide stung. "I told Sam to take the high trail next time," he muttered. "Cattle don't like the narrow." She wrapped the wound with clean muslin. "You always this stubborn, only when I'm right." She tied off the bandage, then rested her hand on his knee, letting it linger. "You're not made of iron, Elijah," he caught her gaze. "No, but I've been held together by worse than thread." She leaned in and kissed him slow, certain, then rested her forehead against his. "You come back with less next time, I'll tan you myself." His breath shook with quiet laughter, and he nodded. "Fair enough." That night, the four of them sat beneath the open sky, wrapped in quilts, watching the stars come out one by one. Ada curled against Beatrice's side, half asleep. Abel leaned against Elijah, still clutching the map. "Do you think stars fall?" Abel asked, voice soft. Elijah answered before Beatrice could. "Only when they're ready to land somewhere." Beatrice glanced at him. He didn't look away. In the weeks that followed, they built a new chicken coop, painted the barn doors, and replaced the porch steps, one board at a time. Beatrice taught Ada how to boil starch for linens. Elijah showed Abel how to saddle his own pony without spooking it. The work filled the days, but it was the quiet between the brushing of dirt from each other's sleeves, the way Elijah always filled her kettle before she noticed it was low that stitched them into something whole. Mid-June brought a letter from Beatrice's uncle in Missouri, written in careful script. He had heard she'd married, asked if she was safe if she needed money. She read it twice, then folded it away and set it in the drawer beneath the flour sack. Elijah found her on the porch afterward, sitting with a tin cup of water, eyes distant. "He want you to come back?" he asked. "No," she said. "He just wanted to know I hadn't disappeared." "You haven't." She looked at him, then at the land stretching out beyond the fence line. "I think I was gone a long time before I ever left." He sat beside her, silent for a while. Then, without prompting, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded square of paper. It was a deed not new, but recently notarized. Her name was scrawled beside his, ink still dark. "I meant to give you this sooner," he said. "Didn't want it to feel like a trade." She unfolded it carefully, heart thudding. "You put me on the land. You built this place same as me. It's yours, all of it." Her fingers trembled. "You didn't have to, I wanted to." She didn't cry. She just reached for him, and he let her, and the sun dipped behind the hills while the crickets sang the night in. They didn't speak again until the sky had gone full dark. "You think we'll get old here?" she asked. Elijah looked out over the fields, where fireflies blinked like lanterns in the tall grass. "If we're lucky." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that until the first owl called from the trees. By early July, the days settled into a rhythm that felt stitched by hand, measured, imperfect, and true. The sun rose early and lingered into the evening, casting long shadows across the pasture. Beatrice woke before the household, stepping barefoot into the cool of the kitchen, where light crept through chinks in the shutters. She lit the stove with practiced hands, her ring catching the flicker as she reached for kindling. Elijah had already gone out by the time the bread was in the oven. The barn door creaked open, then shut again behind him. She knew he was tending the gelding with the cracked hoof, the one he'd been nursing slow with pine tar and patience. He didn't speak much about the horses unless they were sick or wild, but he carried a quiet care for them, same as he did for the children, same as he did for her. Abel came downstairs with one boot in his hand and the other on his foot. "Can I ride by myself today?" he asked, thumb already smeared with saddle soap. Beatrice slid a pan into the oven. "Ask your father, he'll know if the roan's settled enough." "I already did." He said maybe. Then it's still maybe. Abel sighed like the world had wronged him, but he sat at the table and waited for breakfast just the same. Ada arrived next, dragging the hem of a quilt behind her, hair tangled from sleep. She climbed into Beatrice's lap without a word and tucked her face against her neck. Beatrice laid her palm against the girl's back, tracing slow circles. They didn't always talk in the mornings, and Beatrice had learned not to fill the silence unless asked. Later that day, after the chores were seen to and the sun had climbed high enough to burn the dew off the grass, Beatrice walked the edge of the pasture with Elijah. He carried a coil of fencing wire over one shoulder, and she matched his pace, her skirts brushing the sage at her ankles. "Elijah," she said, watching a hawk wheel overhead, "what did your father teach you most about?" He kept walking, the wire shifting against his back. "Not much. He left before I was old enough to ask." Beatrice nodded once. "Mine taught me how to hold still." Said not every fight's worth stepping into. Elijah stopped beside a leaning post and dropped the coil to the dirt. "You believe that?" "Some days," she said. "Others, I think he just didn't want to lose." He knelt and began checking the line, fingers moving with quiet efficiency. "You fight different than he did." She crouched beside him, brushing away a beetle from a knot of grass. "I only fight what tries to take away what's mine." He looked at her then, brow furrowed like he was trying to read something not written. "I've never seen you back down." "I've had to," she said, "but I never stayed down." The wire held firm. Elijah stood and offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her up with ease. His thumb brushed across her wrist before he let go. That evening, a rider came through Mr. Ames from the neighboring claim, hat in hand, sweat on his brow. He brought news of a fire 2 ridges east, sparked by lightning 2 nights back and eating through dry grass faster than they could dig lines. Elijah saddled up without pause, told Abel to mind the chores, and kissed Beatrice's brow before riding out. He didn't look back, but his hand lingered on her shoulder a heartbeat longer than needed. Beatrice stood in the yard as the dust settled, then turned to the children. "He'll be back come morning." They didn't question it. Neither did she. The fire never reached their land, but the smell of smoke hung in the air for 2 days. When Elijah returned, his face and hands were blackened, and his voice sounded like gravel soaked in ash. "Line held," he said, dismounting stiffly. She guided him to the basin, poured water over his hands, and wiped the soot from his neck. He didn't speak much, but she smelled the smoke in his hair and thought about how close the world had come to shifting. That night, the wind turned cooler. Beatrice stood by the window, looking out over the fields. Elijah came up behind her, arms loose around her waist. "You thinking again?" he asked. She leaned back against him. "Just remembering what it felt like to run." "I don't think I ever stopped until I stepped off that wagon." He rested his chin on her shoulder. "You don't have to run here." "I don't want to." They stood like that until the moon rose over the ridge, painting the land in silver. The next week, Elijah took Abel to the hills to set traps for marmot. Ada stayed behind and helped Beatrice mix lye soap near the shed. The child stirred the pot with determined arms, her tongue peeking out as she focused. "Do you think I'll ever be a mother?" Ada asked suddenly. Beatrice looked up from the mold she was lining with cloth. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want to be." Ada's voice was small but sure, "but I don't remember mine real well." Beatrice set down the cloth. "Being a mother isn't always about remembering. Sometimes it's just about staying." "Like you did," Beatrice nodded. "Like I did." Ada smiled then, and it wasn't wide or showy, it was quiet and full of knowing. That evening, Elijah returned with 2 marmots and a new scratch across his cheekbone. Beatrice didn't ask, just wiped it clean and handed him a piece of pie she'd saved. He didn't speak until the edge of the crust was gone. "Abel's getting better at reading the land," he said. "Knows how to find runs without stepping on them. He's watching you." "That's how he's learning." Elijah looked at her, tired but steady. "You think we'll be enough for them?" "We already are," she said. "And when they grow, they'll carry us with them." He reached for her hand then, and she let him hold it in both of his, calloused and warm. Neither of them said more that night. They didn't need to. The house was full, the air was calm, and the fire burned low in the hearth, steady, quiet, and real. The cattle were restless by the time the first real heat settled over the land. July pressed down heavy, and the sky took on a scorched, whitish hue like it had forgotten how to rain. Mornings began earlier, with Elijah moving the herd to higher pasture before the sun cleared the ridge. Beatrice packed him dried beef and damp cloths wrapped in oilskin, and he left before the children stirred. That week, she took Ada and Abel to the river bend north of the property, where cottonwoods leaned over the shallow water and the banks bloomed with wild rose. "Don't go past the flat stone," she told them, pointing to a wide slab that jutted into the current. "You'll lose your footing." She sat on a fallen log with her sewing basket and mended the hem of Elijah's work shirt while the children splashed and argued about who could skip the flattest stone. A dragonfly landed on her knee and sat still. She didn't brush it away. By the time they returned, Elijah was already home, shirt tied around his waist, sweat drying in streaks on his back. He stood by the well, drawing a second bucket with the rope creaking in rhythm. "You left before breakfast," she said, handing him a damp cloth. "Cows broke east fence," he answered, wiping his face. "Took all morning to chase them back through the gully." She stepped closer, lowered her voice. "You're not 20 anymore, Elijah." He gave her a look that held no irritation, only a quiet sort of amusement. "You think I don't know that?" She took the bucket and carried it inside without another word, but she left the back door open so he could follow. That night, the children slept on the porch under a canvas sheet strung between posts. They asked for it, said the breeze was better out there, and the stars made it feel like dreaming while awake. Beatrice let them, so long as they stayed wrapped tight and didn't wander. Inside, she and Elijah sat at the table with the ledger open between them. She'd been keeping the ranch's account since spring, noting repairs, feed orders, and what they'd need come winter. Her handwriting was careful, her sums always correct. "Feed store wants $2 more a bushel than last year," she said, tapping the margin. Elijah rubbed his jaw. "If we sell the 2 stray calves, we'll make up half. Then we'll need to fatten them. We've got time." She nodded and closed the book. "I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd worry about oats and fencing wire. You're not that kind of woman. You're this kind." He reached across the table and brushed her wrist with his fingers. "You make things last." She didn't answer with words. She stood, cross to him, and cupped his face in both hands. He stood, too, and kissed her slow, like the world outside could wait. They didn't speak again until the floor creaked beneath their feet and Abel's voice called through the screen, asking for another blanket. Elijah chuckled low and pulled away, pressing his forehead to hers. "Rain's coming soon," he murmured. "How can you tell?" Cattle were uneasy. "Air smells like it wants to break." She believed him. The storm rolled in 3 days later. Wind first, then a wall of rain that beat the roof and rattled the windows. Beatrice moved the children to the center room, away from glass, and lit the kerosene lamp low. Elijah checked the barn twice during the night, coats soaked through, but returned each time to say the animals were dry and still. When the worst passed and the thunder had faded to a low rumble over the hills, they sat together on the floor, backs against the bed frame, Ada curled in Beatrice's lap, Abel asleep on Elijah's shoulder. Beatrice tilted her head. "You ever think about building on?" He looked down at the boy sleeping against him. "You thinking there'll be more of us?" "I don't know," she said, stroking Ada's hair, "but I wouldn't mind a room with a door that closes." Elijah smiled at that soft and tired and real. "We'll build it." The next morning, they found a branch had come down across the east fence. Elijah chopped it into firewood, and Beatrice hauled the pieces to the stack behind the shed. Neither spoke much, but their movements were in step, like they'd been working side by side for years. That evening, she caught Elijah carving something by lantern light. She didn't ask what until he handed it to her, a small wooden horse, smoothed and painted with ash and ochre. "For the baby," he said. She stared at it, heart tight. "You're sure?" "I've known since you started waking early again. And keeping your hands over your belly when you read." She held the horse close, then set it on the shelf by the kitchen window. Summer ended in a blaze of yellow grass and long twilights. The children chased each other through the fields, hair tangled and feet bare. Beatrice's belly grew, slow and steady, and Elijah built the new room off the back of the house with his own hands, pausing only to sip the lemonade she brought him at midday. They were married by the town's justice that fall, not because anyone demanded it, but because Abel asked if he could tell the others at school that Miss B was really his mama now. Elijah wore his best shirt, and Beatrice pinned a dried flower to her dress. Afterward, they rode home together in the wagon, the children asleep beside them, the hills bathed in the last light of the day. Years passed. The ranch held. The land stayed generous. Elijah taught Abel to shoe a horse without bruising the hoof. Ada baked her first pie with crust that didn't crumble. The baby came a girl with her father's eyes and her mother's quiet strength. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, only because it sounded like light. On Clara's 3rd birthday, Beatrice stood at the threshold of the house, arms crossed over her chest, watching Elijah lift the little girl onto the saddle of her first pony. Ada stood nearby, proud and taller now, and Abel had just returned from town, his boots dusted with road and his hands full of books. Elijah looked up at her. "She's ready." Beatrice nodded, her heart full and still. "So are we." They sat together that evening on the porch bench Elijah had carved from pine, the children playing in the yard as the sun dipped low. Beatrice rested her head on his shoulder, her hand tucked in his. The wind moved through the grass, and the mountains held their color a little longer before night. Elijah kissed her temple, slow as always, and said, "We did all right, didn't we?" She looked out at the land, at the house they'd built, the lives they'd mended. "We did just fine."